In today's video, I'll be talking about Jeremiah and how I think he was not a prophet, but a traitor. Alright, so let's start with my initial hypothesis, which is Jeremiah was not a prophet, but a guardsman who conspired to defect to the Babylonians, but was betrayed by his co-conspirators. And we're going to start in Jeremiah 38:22, and in the white text is a quote. And it says, "Your close friends have misled and overpowered you. While your feet were sunk in the mire, they turned back." All right, so usually, in my opinion, when a biblical author is quoting something, it's being taken from a previous narrative. And the biblical author is taking that quote and it's going to spin it into a new direction by placing it into a new context. And that new context is in the yellow text. And in this instance, it's talking about King Zedekiah after being conquered by the Babylonians. This is what the women would say about him. But if it was from a previous narrative, let's take a look in the text of Jeremiah to see if we can find out anything more to see what the original narrative was. So we're going to go to Jeremiah 38:6, and it says that he was thrown into a cistern, and in that cistern there was mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud. So kind of an unnecessary detail in the narrative, but if it's pulling from a previous narrative where Jeremiah was stuck in the mire, this makes more sense. So let's see if we can find some other instances. In Jeremiah 18:22, it talks about Jeremiah talking about how they dug a pit to capture him and snares for his feet. And then in Jeremiah 20:10, it talks about all of his trusted friends and how they were trying to deceive him. And then in Jeremiah 27, it talks about Jeremiah being deceived, although in this case, the biblical author is attributing that deception to Yahweh. But I think in the original narrative that it was his co-conspirators, and Jeremiah became a laughingstock and was mocked because of that. So in light of that, I would say that Jeremiah was stuck in a pit and some people betrayed him. So if that was the case, who betrayed Jeremiah? Well, there's not, the text doesn't give us a lot to go on. There's one instance in Jeremiah 11:21 where it talks about the men of Anathoth, however you say it, and they were threatening to kill him. It's really the only instance where it talks about these men, so they may have been in the underlying narrative that the biblical author is pulling from. So let's take a look at the original words of Jeremiah to maybe give us some more hints into what this conspiracy was about. So, in my opinion, I think that most of the words in Jeremiah were never actually spoken by Jeremiah. There's so much revisionist propaganda and so many exilic or post-exilic themes that it just doesn't seem likely that these words were ever spoken by Jeremiah. But I do think there are a few instances where we could isolate some quotes that Jeremiah actually said. But these quotes may not have been prophecies. They were just Jeremiah's political assessment, or his assessment of the political situation at the time. So let's have a look. So in Jeremiah 26, there's a quote here in the second paragraph. It says, "This house will be like Shiloh, and this city will be desolate without inhabitant." So just like in the first quote we looked at, this is another quote that I think is, I actually think it was a original quote by Jeremiah, but the biblical author is taking it and is putting it into a new context. And so you see it echoed here in the first context, not entirely, but some of it. and it's attributed to Yahweh, and how he's saying, this is going to happen when Jerusalem is conquered by the Babylonians. But if you look at the original quote in the second paragraph here, it's not necessarily a prophecy if it's standing alone, right? It could just be a political opinion of what was going to happen. And for the next quote, here again in the second paragraph, it says, the exile will be long, build houses and live in them, and plant gardens and eat their produce. And this, again, is echoed in the previous paragraph here, and it's attributed again to Yahweh, claiming what's going to happen with the exile. But again, as a standalone quote in the second paragraph, it may not necessarily be a prophecy, but simply a political opinion of what was going to happen. And then finally, we have another quote in the second paragraph where it says, I was presenting my petition before the king, not to make me return to the house of Jonathan to die there. But in the first paragraph, it's going to say that never happened. What Jeremiah really said was that Zedekiah needed to go over to the Babylonians and surrender. And the original reader would have said, hey, that's not what I heard. I heard that he was petitioning for his life before the king. And so the biblical author here is saying, oh, no, that's, it was, Zedekiah said, don't tell anyone about that. So the conversation had never been heard. So that's why you've never heard of that. So again, in this one, not putting the quote in a new context, but just replacing the quote altogether. So with those in mind, I would say that Jeremiah's statements were political and not prophetic. So if Jeremiah wasn't a prophet, what was he? Well, the text doesn't give us much to go on, but we may be able to figure out what he was by where he was most of the time in the narrative. And that is in the court of the guard. So in the biblical text, it says, there's some kind of temporary jail set up to put Jeremiah in. But in light of what we've discovered here so far, it may make more sense that Jeremiah was a guardsman, because guardsmen tended to hang out in the court of the guard, right? And this may make more sense of Jeremiah 38, verse 4, and why they were so concerned about Jeremiah discouraging the men of war, aka soldiers, because Jeremiah was a soldier himself. And then in Jeremiah 37, the biblical author finds it necessary to tell us who the captain of the guard was. And this may have been necessary if Jeremiah was a captain of the guard, that he didn't want people to get confused about that. So he names this Arijah as captain of the guard. And this story here is pretty suspicious and gives us some insight into what the conspiracy was about. And that is that Jeremiah was trying to go over to the Babylonians or the Chaldeans, right? It says he arrested Jeremiah the prophet, saying, you are going over to the Chaldeans. So the biblical author has to spin this event so that Jeremiah doesn't look bad. And so, how do you get someone trying to go over to the Babylonians during the siege to look good? So the first thing that the biblical author does is to make the event happen when the Babylonians temporarily left. And then the second thing is to set up this whole backstory about Jeremiah buying property, which doesn't make much sense during a siege, but the biblical author tells us that's what Yahweh told Jeremiah to do. And so, no, Jeremiah is not trying to go over to the Chaldeans. He's just going to take possession of some property that he had purchased. So it's a little suspicious to me, but this is what the biblical author wants us to believe. So if Jeremiah was trying to, so with that in mind, I would say that Jeremiah was trying to defect to the Babylonians. All right, so stringing everything together, I would say Jeremiah made the assessment that the Babylonians would stay in power. He conspired with people he trusted. He attempted to defect. He was betrayed by his co-conspirators, and he was caught in a muddy pit. How exactly this all happened, I'm not sure. I've only spent a few days on this, so far this is all that the text has provided me with. But hopefully in the future I can maybe spend some more time and flesh this out further. So if Jeremiah was involved in a conspiracy, what might the biblical author do to counter that narrative? Well, one thing he would do would be to reframe the conspiracy, right? So in Jeremiah 11 it says, "A conspiracy has been found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem." But the biblical author is going to spin this not a conspiracy of Jeremiah, but one that was against Yahweh by the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And then in Jeremiah 15:15 it says that, "Know that for your sake, or Yahweh's sake, I endure reproach." And so this is kind of a theme in throughout Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is saying the things that he says because Yahweh has told him to, not because Jeremiah wanted to. Almost in spite of what people wanted him to say, Jeremiah is only saying these things because Yahweh wanted him to say it. The second thing would be to have Jeremiah speak in public, right? So instead of Jeremiah conspiring and speaking in secret, Jeremiah speaks or writes to, quote, all the people on 5 separate occasions. And the third would be to declare Jeremiah as innocent. Jeremiah is described as a gentle lamb being led to the slaughter. Jeremiah denies that he's going to the Chaldeans and says it's a lie. And then in Jeremiah 37:18, he tells King Zedekiah, "Hey, what have I done? I haven't done anything wrong." And then finally, declare revenge on those who betrayed Jeremiah. So it says that Yahweh would take vengeance, or Jeremiah asked that Yahweh take vengeance on his persecutors. And that Yahweh would redeem him from the grasp of the violent, and he would deal with them in his anger. All right, just as a side note here, this isn't the first time I've claimed that a prophet in the Bible was actually a traitor. I also say that of Elisha, so be sure to check out my podcast series on Elijah and Elisha. Specifically, the city of Dothan kind of highlights that aspect of Elisha being a traitor. All right, so what happened to Jeremiah? The biblical text that he says that he eventually went down to Egypt, but I'm going to propose that he was actually executed. All right, so there's a few different places in Jeremiah where the biblical author seems to be trying to convince the reader that Jeremiah hadn't died. And this is one of those places in Jeremiah 26 where the priests and prophets are saying a death sentence for Jeremiah, and then the officials and the people are saying no death sentence for Jeremiah. But then we have this really interesting story in the last part of Jeremiah 26. And it talks about this prophet Uriah. And it says that his words were very similar to those of Jeremiah, and that Uriah had been executed by King Jehoiakim, but that Jeremiah had not been put to death. So it's kind of like the biblical author is trying to give the original reader a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, you thought Jeremiah was executed. No. That was Uriah. He had very similar words to Jeremiah, and he was the one that was executed. So I think that's what the biblical author is trying to do here. And this is also suspicious because King Zedekiah has already been introduced into the Jeremiah narrative. And so in this chapter here, we're going back in time to King Jehoiakim. And there's a few places in Jeremiah where the chronology is out of order, and this is one of those places, which makes it even more suspicious. So with that in mind, I would propose that Jeremiah was executed for treason. And I'm going to stretch, and I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to say, and his body was disposed of in an empty cistern. Now, why would I say that? Well, for one, he was cast into an empty cistern, right? And this is kind of unusual, kind of an unusual jail to put Jeremiah in. But if this was happening during the siege of the Babylonians, it would make sense that cisterns are empty because water supply would be running low. But if people were dying from starvation and they're trapped in the city, where do you put the dead bodies, right? And one solution to that would be to put them in the empty cisterns. And this isn't unheard of. Later in Jeremiah, we have people being slaughtered and having them put into a empty cistern. Even though this doesn't take place in Jerusalem during the siege, but it does set a precedence that it can happen. And then also it talks about Jeremiah being let down with ropes. So this is another one of those seemingly unnecessary details of the narrative, but it would make sense if the biblical author is trying to show that Jeremiah wasn't dead and was thrown into this cistern, but that Jeremiah was alive and was let down with ropes instead. All right, so that is my theory. Like I said, hopefully I can flesh this out a little bit more in the future, but that's what I have as of right now. Let me know what you think. Thanks.